Welcome, everyone. And for many of you, welcome back. This is the third in a series of events we at Devex have been honored to host with our colleagues at EFAD. And we're focusing these events on the importance of food security, of rural people, at a moment when the world's attention is really understandably focused on something else, the COVID-19 response. But of course, these things, as I think all of you know who are joining us, are quite connected. And that's what we're here to discuss. And we've got an incredible lineup of speakers with real expertise on these issues. And we want to dig one or two levels deeper, if we can, into that big picture question. I remember back in March and April, when the pandemic was first really hitting, speaking with one of the global leaders on nutrition, who said, I'm worried we might need to hit the pause button on our work on nutrition because there simply isn't enough interest or attention or focus right now on this topic. Everyone rightly is focused on the race to make a vaccine and treatments and diagnostics for the pandemic. But of course, everyone who's part of this world, who works at EFAD and other institutions like it, they know well that for many people in the world today, it's not the initial crisis, it's the after effects. And we saw that with Ebola, where some 11,000 people tragically died from the disease itself in West Africa 5-6 years ago now. But many more than that from other health conditions when they couldn't access their health system, or from poverty in general, from lack of nutrition in general. And these are challenges for people who live hand to mouth day to day. So we're here to talk about rural people, their importance in the world, their importance for all of us, for the food that's on our tables every day, and the importance for the world to think about rural people and the need to invest there. So this is the third, as I say, in a series of conversations. I'm really excited to bring it to you. I think you're going to enjoy the discussion very much today as we have the last two. If you want to be a part of it, I encourage you to follow us at Devex on Twitter. You can use the hashtag Devex events or hashtag invest in rural people. You can follow me directly on Twitter at Raj_Devex. And any of the people that you see on the screen today. We want to hear from you. We want your feedback. And so we invite you and welcome you, whichever platform you're on today as you're watching this event. So thank you. I want to begin by asking Dr. Martin Frick to please turn on his video. And Martin, great to see you. You are the Deputy to the Special Envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021. 2020 was meant to be a really big year in food systems and nutrition. And due to the pandemic, a lot of the global convenings and fundraising efforts have moved to 2021. I want to get into that in a minute with you. But I thought we would just start at a high level. When you think of the issues around nutrition, food security, and the pandemic, where do they connect? How do you see this at a high level?
Well, thanks, Raj. And very often they indeed do not connect. And that's exactly where the problem is. And that's the key reason why this summit is not the UN Food Summit, but the UN Food System Summit. We want to look particularly into the interconnection of these issues. And, it's not only just one moment in time, but it's a one-year engagement process of which country-level dialogues led by the countries' governments themselves are a key element. And we want to do that particularly to connect the communities also in country. So those people in, the example of today who are fighting COVID, they need to understand that nutrition is the best measure against pandemics, that people can only be healthy if they have access to nutritious food. But this nutrition, for example, directly relates to issues such as soil health. Soil health, in return, is a massive issue when it comes to climate change resilience, but also to mitigation. So these interconnections between the different areas, this is really what we are trying to do with this summit and, fostering the understanding how one area is directly affecting the other.
Yeah, I think back to what I was just describing, the early days of the pandemic, at least in many countries in the world. Obviously, this started earlier in Asia, but for many people, March and April were the kind of big moment when they realized their societies were locking down. And I remember the big advice we got from health authorities was wash your hands. And that was stark in a couple of ways because it was so simple and basic for many people living in advanced societies. Of course, we should do this and we can do this. This is not a hardship. It's not asking much of us. And then when you turn your lens to so many people living in low income and fragile societies, well, they don't have running water at home. They don't have access to basic hygiene materials like soaps. So you realize that some of the things we take for granted simply aren't there. And I think the same thing applies for nutrition.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And, it's for me one of the big paradoxes of this planet that the majority of the people who are food insecure are actually people who are food producers themselves. So there's an obvious mismatch here. And I think, and climate change is pushing us in this direction. COVID certainly also does. I think we need to step 3 steps back and look at farmers and see what they are doing and what they could be doing if we would bring more support to farmers, if we change the view that we are having of farmers from simple producers of foodstuff to actually agents of change for the big issues such as climate change by, for example, restoring degraded land.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think that's why this that you mentioned before, it's not the food summit, it's the food system summit. We're all kind of getting used to this concept of food systems. Systems problems are more complex to understand, but the idea is that it touches on many aspects of life, and many of the core pillars, like of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, would connect to something like food. It's not literally just the nutrition challenge, although that is big too. I wonder, given your role, you're closer to the figures. What has this pandemic and all of the measures around it, what has it meant for actual nutrition statistics around things like stunting and wasting and hunger? Give us a sense of, have we seen a real impact from it?
Well, we continue to see a real impact. I mean, the numbers are not in yet, but let's not forget that already in 2019, for the first time in many years, the hunger numbers were going significantly up. And we will see that number really further going up. And, in terms of nutrition, we can only estimate, but this will definitely affect so many children and so many people in developing countries. And many of those who are actually victims of COVID are also in that position because of lack of access to nutritious food.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that, because it is not just low-income countries. These issues around food are global, and it's both people, children underweight and overweight for their age. And it's a lack of healthy nutrition across the board. This is really something I think any person, regardless of their society, can connect to at a very personal level, because it does touch us in every way. In fact, we're going to soon be hearing from a Michelin star chef, and I hope that conversation helps to connect this to all of us. I wonder, in the last remaining few minutes that we have, if we could just put our focus on the UN Food Systems Summit itself. What do you actually hope to achieve out of that summit? Do you see it as a moment for raising funds, or is it more about raising awareness? What do you actually want to see the world do as it comes together around that summit?
Well, we're definitely looking into actions and commitments to actions that would drive the 2030 agenda forward. But to me, one of the key things that we really want to do, and we are well underway, is building a global food systems community in many, many local food systems communities, bringing together the people that normally are not linked. Why would a doctor talk to a soil scientist, for example? And creating this solution space that gives food systems really the importance and centrality in governments that it actually should have. I mean, if you're just thinking in environmental terms, nothing kills more biodiversity. Food as a system is well south of a third of the global greenhouse gas emissions. We don't look at that because we only look at agriculture, where we know that the number should be around 20-21%. But if you are factoring in food waste, transport, cold chains, plastic wrapping, and so on, it's absolute central that we are getting this piece together. So it's about action, it's about building the community, but it's also very much around changing the global narrative, seeing things that depend. And that is particularly true for business. Many of the bad business, if I can say so, is only possible because we are looking at many negative impacts as externalities. They are not appearing in a balance sheet. And many of the investments that would be needed are not happening because they have seen in isolation. And, something like empowering farmers, empowering women in rural farming, brings so many benefits that the investment actually looks to be a very sound one. So one big aspect is also to bring the huge finance community around the issues, public finance, environmental finance, but also private finance, to look into the models that we could actually build to support transformation of food systems worldwide.
Well, I thank you for that last message, especially because it's such a powerful idea that really big global challenges like the climate or poor health for whole societies, that the solution to that could be the smallholder farmer in a faraway place, right? That actually there may be the solution. They are the agent of that change if we can just empower them with the tools that they need, financial tools, technological tools, training and such, that there's so many opportunities if we just change our focus from the smallholder farmer as a victim at the bottom of a system to actually the solution. And I think that's a powerful way to frame the summit.
And indeed, we have very many technical solutions now available. We need to bring it together, from satellite imagery to cheap sensors where you can measure things like soil organic carbon content, to financial innovations, blockchain, mobile payment, that you can really funnel payments all the way to the smallholder farmer without the money getting stuck in inefficiencies. So that is what we hope to do.
Well, I wish you very good luck with that. And we'll certainly be following it closely at Devex, as food systems is one of our core areas of focus, as I'm sure you and others following this know. So we wish you the very best for that summit, and we will be there. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I would now like to welcome another fireside chat conversation, I think just hopefully as interesting and fruitful as the last one, but with someone with a very different background, and that is Christina Bauerman. Welcome, Christina. We're not hearing you yet. I think maybe we have you on mute.
Yes. Now.
There you are. Nice to see you. And I love the backdrop that you're in front of, because I'm guessing that may be the restaurant where you were the head chef.
Yes. Yes, it is. It is Glassosteria. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting topic. And I've been involved with this kind of problems for now a long time. And it's always so refreshing to see so many people involved in this amazing, incredible problem to solve. Because I've been dealing with this for only a few years, but I know that you've been dealing with this for a long time.
Well, thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. I guess I wonder, you're someone who works with food every day. You feed people, of course, at a very high level. You're a Michelin-starred chef. How do you think about these issues about where food fits into society, culture, and the realities that so many people simply don't have access to even the most basic food today?
Well, it is like you were saying earlier, it is a paradox. There are so many millions of people that can't eat, and there are so many millions of people who are always on a diet. So there's so much food waste. There's so much food that is actually could be used in a different way, but also the culture of food. Because we are in a society, we don't have the problem of eating most of the time, even though during this COVID period, we see lines and lines of people who actually don't have any food, any nutritional value to food. It's nothing. Anything that they can eat, they eat. So the problem is actually right now more evident than it used to be. As a chef, one of the things that I've always done, probably because of my background, I travel a lot. I lived outside of Italy for such a long time. I've always been against the total closure to other sources. You know, in Italy, but I think in a lot of countries right now, they are basically perpetrating, they are like pushing the agenda that you should use only the food that comes to you from your country, which is in a sort of way understandable, especially this COVID period. But I always thought that actually using food that comes from countries that really need an exposure, that really need to sell their food to outside countries. And in that particular case, the advantages that the earlier speaker was talking about is amazing. That will give a chance to countries to evolve. That will give those people, especially women, and I met many from India, for instance, that created kind of co-op or enterprises that try to sell outside of their countries, and that will really make a difference. So in a
Such an
certain
important point, because we think so much about the immediate solution to a problem. And I think a lot of people said, well, I want to eat local food. And it's become quite a movement in many countries, because it's, I want to reduce the reliance on the big food industry and also on the environmental impacts of transporting food. I want local, fresh, support my local farmer. And that's a pretty appealing sentiment. I certainly understand it. It appeals to me. But your point is right, that actually there are some after effects if we only think in those terms, and there's a lot of other people who will be affected.
you know we just have to look at history and things that happened in the past with other countries. Some countries evolve and some country become more self-sufficient just because maybe one or two or three of their products. Let's look at Cuba, let's look at Peru. They became, they evolved themselves, and so they had an opportunity to actually become like a real entrepreneurial country, and therefore their civilization, their advanced in rights, people rights, happened because of money that came from some of these products. So if I have a chance, of course I do prefer seasonal, local, but if I do have a chance, I do use products that come from other countries that I know need.
An example, in your Michelin-starred restaurant, how would you source food products? How do you think about this?
Well, let's talk about it like a simple one. Let's talk about sumac. It's a spice, a spice that I've been using for 10 years. But one of the main reasons is because it comes from Middle Eastern countries in which women, especially women, do not have the same rights as men. But there are like many co-op and many entrepreneurial situations in which they earn money because I buy sumac, and maybe other people because I've seen other chefs using it. So
once someone tries it, they will never stop using sumac. So you may be introducing it to a lot of people.
I love sumac. But for instance, when I had an opportunity to go to India, I met some women that created some co-op, for instance, for fish markets. They had a pond, they fished, and then they want to sell their fish to the market. But this way, I'm not saying that I have to use their fish, but I can use some other products that come from that country, because that's the only way to actually give them a chance to become self-sufficient and autonomous for certain ways. Unfortunately, or fortunately, some of these progress come with food or through food. So I really do make a point to use in my kitchen, in my cuisine, some of the products that come from the poorest countries, because this way I give a chance. In my mind, maybe I do not make any difference, but it doesn't matter. In my mind, it does, to give them a chance to actually have an opportunity to progress. And
I think, well, certainly export markets are an important part of developing an agricultural industry in many countries. And I think that lens you're bringing to the discussion is really important. I wonder, for people watching this and thinking, well, you're cooking at a very high level. What about people who have low income, low resources? Is it possible in our societies today to eat a nutritious, healthy diet for very little cost? Or is that sort of out of reach? You have to be rich to eat healthy, essentially.
Well, I always thought of myself as sort of Robin Hood. I kind of steal from the rich to give to the poor. I do a lot of work for companies or societies or organizations that help out countries that really need it. Just to mention some, IFAD is one of those, but Chef Manifesto, ActionAid, especially if they focus on women, that's something I'm really keen on, of course, being a woman. And I really do think that there is a chance, but first of all, we have to focus on what's nutrition and who needs it. I don't think, sometimes I read articles or they ask me throughout interviews, whenever you prepare a meal, you think about nutrition. I'm like, people come to my restaurant once, maybe every 3 months. We are not talking about nutrition. We're talking about something else that has nothing to do with food and nutrition. Whenever I focus, for instance, on people who really need nutrition, then that's something different. So what I think it is our job is to diffuse some of the products that from countries that really need it. Second, and so make them popular in order to create a sort of movement and people start to use that particular ingredient. And second, most importantly, to keep on like focusing on the paradox of nutrition, which we talked about in the beginning. And second, most importantly, to participate to anything that diffuses that message. That's why I participate and I'm involved in organizations, worldwide organizations that focus on, for instance, the lack of food. You were saying in the beginning about water. That is something, that is a campaign that I participated with ActionAid. It's like for us, it's normal. We go home, yeah, wash your hands. You know, for us, it's normal. But there are some countries that to get water, they need to walk miles and they don't even get pure water. And so washing your hands is something that doesn't belong to their tradition. So it is our role, especially if you have an audience, especially if you have some kind of power in the sense of convincing some of the companies to donate, or for instance, to create a campaign that diffuses kind of message to help those situations. I remember participating to Seeds and Chips, a few years ago in Milan, and they were really talking about the problem of water, of like some of the caves that deviated like rivers and so on. So there were so many countries in Africa that, for instance, didn't have any water. And so, of course, right now, the problem is 10 times worse because we are in COVID season, we are in COVID period in which people need more water than ever. So I think it is our role to diffuse the message, use some of the ingredients that come from the poorest countries in order to give them a chance to grow from an economical point of view, and domino effect, it will somehow involve some kind of like relationships and evolvement from a cultural point of view. And again, I am not against seasonal, I am not against local, but I am not one of those people that says we need to close down our borders and use only Italian food or only American food or only whatever food. I think that it is our intelligence and maturity that need to push us to take a decision. This one, yes, this one, no. And stay away from whatever it is, the globalization of some of the products which make us believe that we use and we buy local food, but instead it's not.
But it's not. Yeah. Well, Christina, I've got to thank you for bringing such an interesting perspective to everyone today. You really bring a different one based on your background. And I think the point you've made helps all of us to think a little bit more deeply, even about what we buy. Those of us who don't run a restaurant, but what we're buying in our own kitchens, our own households. And at a minimum, you've gotten everyone thinking about sumac who has not tried it before. So maybe you've made an impact right there. I want to thank you for taking the time to join the discussion today and to help highlight these issues. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now I want to turn to a couple of voices from IFAD working in different parts of the world to try to give us a flavor for what's going on in different areas and in a more diverse sense. So we have the country director for Burundi, that's Aissa Toure, and the IFAD country director for Cambodia and Laos, that's Kaushik Baru. And we're going to hear some words from them from where they're based around the world, and then we'll be back.
I'm Aissa Toure, IFAD's country director for Burundi. Over the past 20 years, IFAD and its partners have invested in projects food production in Burundi for rice, for dairy, for maize, and in turn has improved the nutrition situation for many. Imagine you come from a community that believes that access to agriculture, to livestock and land is not for you because you're too poor. To feed your family, you have to work on people's land. School is a far-fetched dream for your children. This is the situation Rose Kabashinga found herself in before receiving IFAD's support. But since she received a cow, not only she was able to improve the nutrition situation of her family through the consumption of the milk on a daily basis, but she was also able to increase her income through selling the surplus of the milk that was used, this income, to buy food and pay for school fees. In IFAD, we believe that investing in nutrition through agriculture is not only socially responsible, but it's good economics.
Hello, my name is Kaushik Barua, and I'm the IFAD Country Director for Cambodia and Laos. Across Asia, smallholder farmers and their families produce most of the food that we consume. But in their own homes, they often do not have rich enough or diverse enough diets. In Laos, for instance, in many rural provinces, child malnutrition is as high as 61%. IFAD is partnering with the government of Laos across 400 villages. We are developing irrigation systems. We are training farmers to use sustainable agricultural technologies. And we are establishing farmer nutrition schools where women act as change agents. Through these interventions, we hope to produce healthy, nutritious food to families across rural Laos. I call upon global leaders to support IFAD in its nutrition-sensitive agricultural development interventions. Thank you.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I thought those videos did a great job of highlighting what the work is of IFAD and how it actually pertains to the real lives of people. We're going to get more into some of these both very local and specific aspects of the conversation, as well as the high-level global ones. I want to welcome our panelists to join us now. We have Aksel Jacobsen, the State Secretary of International Development in Norway, Dr. Donald Brown, the Associate Vice President for IFAD, and Isatou Diallo, the founder and executive director for the Africa Catalyzing Action for Nutrition Network. We welcome all of you, and let's make sure that we're all able to turn on our cameras and be here. We will, in a moment, be hearing from Emanuela Del Rey, who's the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Italy. But just first, before we start her video, I wanted to give us a kind of a high-level sense of what this conversation is going to be about, because we'd like to get into sort of where does this conversation around nutrition and agriculture fit into the SDGs. And really, when you think about the people who are actually working, it was remarkable to hear Kaushik from Cambodia and Laos say that many of the farmers themselves don't have access in their own diet and their own household to the nutritious food that they need. So we want to try to square some of these issues together. And first, we'll go to our Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Italy, Emanuela Del Rey, to get the conversation started with her opening remarks, and then we'll jump back into the panel.
Dear friends, Italy and IFAD have shared for a long time the strong and challenging commitment to create a world where the poorest of the poor have access to healthy diet and sufficient nutrition. As the Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, I eagerly believe that nutrition and food security should stand among our top priorities, and this is why Italy welcomes and supports the sensitive approach of IFAD to nutrition as reflected in the Action Plan 2019-2025. This issue is even more serious and alarming in this time in history in which the pandemic drives an increasingly number of people into hunger. UN data, in fact, suggest that the pandemic may increase by 130 million people the total number of undernourished in the world in 2020, which stood at 690 million chronically and 150 million acutely food insecure in late 2019. The economic impact of COVID-19 and the mitigation measures taken to contain the disease threatened to create a serious and expanding food and nutritious crisis in the years ahead. We keep on striving to achieve the SDG 2, ending hunger. It is time then to raise awareness on the need for appropriate policies to attract targeted private investments in nutrition, but also in supporting stronger and more efficient supply chains. Empowering rural people and the smallholder farmers by increasing their productive capacity is the only real investment that can make communities more viable and resilient while fully respecting their culture, their traditions, and their social context. Of course, we shall not forget that a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach is needed, considering the cross-cutting issues related to nutrition insecurity, which involves environment, climate, gender, and the youth. An adequate nutrition is absolutely essential, and of course, to tackle this problem, we need to provide future generations with the physical and intellectual capacities their countries need to benefit from. Italy keeps, of course, on devoting greater attention to the most vulnerable groups: children, adolescents, and women. We do this by broadly supporting education as a way to foster school feeding in the most fragile countries. Access to healthy diet is key for young people to attend schools. The 2021 Food System Summit will offer an extraordinary and unique opportunity. I would actually say an historical momentum to collect all the lessons learned from the past and reflect on concrete measures to better enable food systems to deliver and support healthy diets. I appreciate the strong engagement of member states in the different working groups who are preliminarily shaping the guidelines of the Food System Summit through positive interactions and discussions. Let me also mention the Food Coalition, an initiative we launched and are supporting in partnership with FAO. Our goal is to prevent the health crisis from becoming a food and supply chain crisis. Its strength, it's really in its collective approach. As the project is up and running, I want to thank those countries that have joined our efforts and hope that many others will do too. I really want to thank you, and I wish you all a very fruitful debate. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to welcome our panelists back. We just got some great opening remarks to kind of kick off our conversation from Emanuela, who brought up, I think, a number of key issues, and our panelists can just turn on their cameras when they get a chance to do that. She talked about the importance of engaging the private sector. She talked about having resilient supply chains for food, and then ultimately thinking about nutrition itself as a key issue here. I know we're joined by Isatou Diallo. Isatou, I don't know if you're able to turn on your camera. We'd love to see you to kind of kick off the discussion with you directly if we can. Given your role, Isatou, as a nutritionist yourself, and so I wonder if you can pick up, given your work across the continent of Africa, on what have been the impacts on nutrition during this pandemic. What are you actually seeing in the places where you work?
Thank you very much. As a nutritionist, I have never been happier than listening to the speakers before me, because we used to struggle. In fact, let me say more than struggle. We used to fight hard to get nutrition on the agenda of agriculture and other sectors. But all the speakers I've listened to today talked about nutrition. So my work is done. Just have to push for more action. Now, as far as the pandemic is concerned, the African continent, we had made some progress, although too slowly. We had made some progress in stunting, for example, even though we still have 30% of children under 5 who are stunted. We still have about 7% of children who are wasted. But we are talking about the triple burden of malnutrition, which is just not about underweight, which we have focused before on in the past. But we're talking about overweight, obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases, which is unfortunately on the rise. And we're talking about micronutrient deficiencies, because I believe that should stand alone, because there's not a single country in Africa that is on course to meet the global target of reducing anemia. So that is serious. And globally, we know that we're talking about over 2 billion people globally with macronutrient deficiencies. So it is a major health problem, a hidden health emergency. So as far as the pandemic is concerned, we don't have the figures yet, but we expect that it is going to impact greatly on nutrition. Because let's think about the people who are mostly affected, people who have to go out on a daily basis to get an income to buy the food that is to feed themselves and their families. With the lockdown and other measures in place, reducing access to markets, reducing access to income, definitely it has an impact. And you hear people, I've heard people talk about, I stay home, so it's a choice, or I go out. So it's a choice of it's a choice of death from hunger or death from the COVID virus. So what a terrible choice we have to make in this
and all these things, there are ripple effect, as you say, where maybe my choice, following the rules of the health authorities here in the United States, and I say I'm going to stay home, has a ripple effect on my purchasing, which has a ripple effect all the way down. And of course, it ends up hurting the most vulnerable people at the end of that chain, who don't have many choices and who don't have savings, and countries that don't have fiscal space to address these issues. But you're so right as a nutritionist to point out that nutrition isn't just about, let's just get food to people. There's enough food in the world. It's really thinking about this as a number of challenges that have to be addressed, including micronutrients, and ensuring the food people are eating is the right food, the healthy food that they should get. And I wonder, I just want to bring Donald into the conversation about how you think about where farmers fit into this. At IFAD, your focus really is on rural communities and on the farmers in those communities. How do they fit into the kind of global picture that Isatu just painted for us?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And hello to everybody. I think it's really said a lot. And, I like to think about farmers, but I like to think more about rural households because, very often, people in rural areas are not just farmers. And I think this is quite important when you think about nutrition. Farming is often one aspect of their lives. They're like everybody else in the world. They're trying to make enough money to feed their families, send their kids to school. And very often they have a whole range of occupations, and farming is often a seasonal aspect of that. So I like to think about it more about rural households, and I like to take what I call a livelihoods lens to that rather than just a farming lens to it. So what do rural households need to survive, to thrive? And farming is one aspect of that. Now, obviously, if we're talking about nutrition, if we're talking about food, farming is really important, and apologies for the phone going off in the background.
We're all used to this now.
Farming is one aspect to that, because it's about food production in that context. But often for farming households and rural households, as important is where do they get their incomes from that are often non-farming. It can be remittances from the city, from their children that have gone there or whatever, because it's not just about the physical access to food and growing it, it's actually having money to do it. And I think this is really, really important when we think about balanced diets and nutrition, because they need that ability to access a wide range of foods. So when I think about IFAD and I think about farmers, going back to your question and some of the aspects of it, a really key part of our intervention is, to say, one, taking a livelihoods perspective, but secondly, trying to avoid, and I think there's a real tendency for development organizations to focus on one or two crops, particularly staple crops. It's all about maize, or it's about rice, or it's something like that. And we understand the importance of those issues, but for poor rural people, they already have an incredible range of indigenous crops and foods out there, which we're kind of ignoring. So our interventions with someone like IFAD has to be, fine. There's a major market out there for rice or for wheat, which they can gain incomes from, but linking that intervention with education about food and nutrition, but also giving them an opportunity, for example, to also improve their market gardens as part of this process, and ensuring that they are growing a range of crops. And particularly for us, dealing with some of the poorest people, they're the people who often most understand the indigenous plants, the range of traditional foods and the importance of them out there. So it's not undervaluing that. It's actually taking a community approach and encourage them to use their indigenous knowledge and their indigenous sources. And we'll come on to it later, I'm sure. But, you know, in that context, women are so important because they really, really understand that. So, you know, I say production's one part of it, but for me and for IFAD, it's about that wide variety of interventions and not just a narrow one. But secondly, often we take what we call a value chain approach. So it's looking from production right through to processing, to marketing, to food on a plate. And the reason I just say that to finish is because very often, if you just focus, many people in agricultural interventions focus on the production. Often, you know, the processing, the storage to ensure that food is not wasted or lost with post-harvest losses, or that they have easy access to markets, because food that you can't sell is not much good to you. You can only eat a certain amount of it. And to me, the incomes that families can derive are as important as growing the food itself. And, you know, and actually the value added, the money that families will make, most of it doesn't come from growing the food. You get very little back for that. It's about being able to process that food and sell it. So how do you have that holistic intervention? And obviously linked to that is education, because it doesn't matter in the end what you grow or have access to if you don't understand some of that. So kind of combining nutritional education things into our project as well is really important. I'll stop
I think
there.
You've given us a great way to think about this, how all these issues are really integrated. And it reminds me, in fact, of a rural family that I interviewed in Southwest Ethiopia some years ago, and talking to the husband and wife, who explained that it was the diversification of their crops. They were growing maize, but they added to it some legumes, some beans, and some other crops. And that made all the difference for their family. Their kids had not been in school, and they were able to get their kids into school just by making that diversification effort. And of course, so much of it, just going back to the conversation with the chef, Christina, who was with us a few moments ago, is about linking their production to the market, either domestically in the city or internationally, if you really want to provide the sources of income these farming families need. So I think you did a great job laying that out for us. Axel, I'd like to bring you into it, because you're leading Norway's International Development Department, and Norway is a leading donor country on so many issues. We see Norway showing up around vaccines, Gavi, and for the coronavirus as well. We see you showing up across climate issues, environmental issues of all kinds. And now here you are also showing up around the food issues. And I guess I want to understand how you as a donor think about the connection points among all of these, and where you think we are in this moment of food systems and going into 2021, an important year for it.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you for setting up this webinar. It's been really interesting to listen to the participants. And yes, you are right. When coming into this field, you know, Norway is a leader in global health, and we were doing a lot of work on education. But what we could see was there was something missing here, because and that was food, really, because in health, the backbone of health is nutritious food, and to learn in school you need food, and so we soon understood we have to focus more on food and nutrition, and that's been our focus more and more the later years, and I think SDG 2 on zero hunger is really the key to eradicate poverty and to reach many of the other global goals. And unfortunately, we have seen that since 2014, for the 6 last year, the world has gone in the wrong direction on food security and on hunger, fighting hunger. And we really need to turn this tide around. And you know, as many have mentioned, COVID-19 has worsened the food security even more. And so we are a health crisis, and we have an economic downturn, and thereby a food crisis at the same time. And this is really a tragedy for individuals and for whole communities. And hunger, it undermines people's future prospects. And so to ensure access to sufficient food and safe and healthy food is a prerequisite for good education, good health, and also for education and for development as a whole. And let me just, before a living. Last week, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the World Food Program and David Beasley. And you know, he's an excellent communicator, and he said it very simply, that we have a cure for the hunger pandemic, and it's called food. It's that simple, and that's difficult. It is of fundamental importance that the food is nutritious and affordable to people. And we just got a report the other day from Ceres 2030, and it says it's possible to produce enough food to 10 billion people. So, but we need to really have a holistic approach to this and look both on the diet and nutrition. We need to look at the production of food, and we need to look at the market and the value chain, as well as looking at governance and good policies for this field. And I think that's the holistic approach we need to take to this field. And what I think we have some good momentum now with the Nobel Peace Prize. Hopefully will be a momentum to really step up on fighting hunger. And also next year's Food Summit will be very important in this work.
Maybe I can just ask a quick follow-up question before coming back to the rest of the panel, which is, when I talk to leaders in nutrition, they say that they've had a hard time raising funds and raising the prioritization of nutrition over many years. You just described how the situation's gotten worse in many cases. And yet, to David Beasley's point, often we know the scalable solution. You know, often we know vitamin A tablets or something. Like, we have an idea of things that work around micronutrients. We see them work at scale. We feel like we could invest more and do more. Why is it that nutrition hasn't gotten the kind of attention or funding in the donor community that maybe all of us here would like to see it have? And do you think 2021 really can be a watershed year, a major change, because of the pandemic, because of the highlighting of all of people going hungry around the world? Could we see something significant happen in 2021, or do you think it will be more similar to prior years?
I really do believe that we will see a change here. I mean, before 2015, we had decades of the number of hunger going down. And after, you know, Live Aid and all that, and kind of the focus have shifted. And we have seen that before, that focus have shifted, and we have forgotten the most basic things. And food production is the most basic thing. And if you don't have food, you don't have development. So I really think that many are going to see this and going to step up. And I mean, we have to. We just have to.
Thank you, Axel. Isatu, I'd like to just bring you back into the discussion to get any reactions you have to what you've heard so far.
Oh, it's really interesting. I learn a lot.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Isatu.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to highlight one point. I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. As women, we are not vulnerable. We find ourselves in vulnerable situations. We are tough, very resilient. That's one point. And then also going back to the issue of food production, I've heard it mentioned several times. Agriculture has now put the nutrition in food production. Agriculture is saying, we feed people, before it said, we feed people. Now it's saying, we nourish people. And I'm also happy about the issue raised on indigenous and traditional crops. Not much investment there. They're there, but even the consumers have a different perception when it comes to traditional and indigenous crops. It's supposed to be for the hunger season, when you can't afford anything else, so you go and look for traditional indigenous crops. It's not something that you can compare with imported, highly processed, high fat, high salt, low in nutrients that you go and buy from the supermarket. So that's another point. So we need to invest more in these crops. And as a nutritionist, You go to the communities, you want to promote these crops, but you don't have enough information about the nutrient content. So the information, the investment goes beyond just promoting these crops. It's actually getting the data, the information on the nutrient content. So the food systems, we can't do the food systems without incorporating traditional indigenous crops. And the pandemic is showing us the way, because I mean, the airports there was a shutdown, borders, airports, and you find people actually looking for these indigenous traditional crops. And finally, we talk about the food systems, but we are leaving out one very important group, the informal vendors. A lot of the population in Africa buy food buy street foods. They depend on street foods. And we're not just talking about the rural communities. I also talk about the rural communities a lot, but we must remember people in the urban areas, peri-urban areas, the urban slums, who are also in the informal sector. So the food system has to be based on the context. And we should really talk to communities and have a national dialogue. What does the food system mean for me? What is the food system? What are the different components of the food system for my country, for example, or for the region or for the continent? That dialogue has to, and we'll see diverse food systems. But there will be commonalities in all these food systems. And then also, finally, I hope you'll allow me to say this.
Please.
We put a lot of burden on the woman. I mean, we say, and I've said it too, the women are key to food security. Women are key to nutrition security. If we give them all the resources, and food security will improve. Let's turn it around. Women are the key to sustainable development. But how are they key to sustainable development? By focusing on their health and nutrition status and well-being along the life cycle. Let's take the malnutrition cycle and look at the malnutrition cycle through a gender lens. At each stage of the life cycle, what is it that is keeping women malnourished? From pregnancy throughout the life cycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, yeah, so, I think of it like this: so much of human progress is based on just reframing the narrative. And I think what you've tried to do, I think very eloquently, is reframe that narrative that we're all living with. One is, how do you see women? Are they vulnerable and victims, or are they the agents of change in their own lives and in their communities? As soon as you shift your thinking in this way, it changes our whole approach. Donald earlier was speaking about rural communities and farmers as being the agents of change. And when we change the frame, it changes how we think about investing as well, which is, of course, what IFAD is doing in rural communities all over the world. And if an agriculture company or an agricultural minister thinks of the goal of agriculture not just in the yield, how much tonnage of crops can we grow in a month, but in the well-being of people, how healthy are people, that's a very different approach and might lead you to many different decisions. And so I think that framing that you gave us is so important. We are sadly getting very near out of time. And Donald, I want to go to you for some final thoughts from you. We've had a rich discussion. What comes to mind for you to help close us out? Great.
So maybe 4 points. Firstly, I think what we haven't talked about here is one of the challenges with nutrition, and it's nutrition generally, and it's nutrition particularly in the countries and with the populations that IFAD work with, is it's really quite difficult. Because if you take something like nutrition from a government perspective, no one, it's an orphan, no one really leads on it, and it needs a really, really multi-dimensional cross-sectoral approach. So, we've been talking about it as though it's an agriculture issue. It's not. It's part of that. It's an education issue. It's a health issue. But of course, it's one of those cross-cutting policy areas that just falls between the cracks. It very often falls between the cracks in rich countries, let alone poor countries. So there's a lot of fine words and commitments around nutrition, but to really sort of make a difference and implement it, it becomes really quite different. So I think there's a whole kind of a governance issue around nutrition and who leads that we need to think about in this context. And how do you break through that, and how do you get that co-ownership across a bunch of ministries, probably at the presidential prime ministerial level that can then drive it down through a range of ministries, because it's so multidimensional. So that'd be my first point. My second point is I come back to this whole thing about, as we've just been discussing, indigenous knowledge, people-centered approaches, working with the communities. I think Istal made a really good point about, they kind of have coping mechanisms. They kind of know what we're doing. In many ways, we've messed it up by trying to impose outside solutions on things. So that they have had traditional coping mechanisms for the lean season, made much worse through climate change, et cetera, but we've got to go back and use that knowledge and build on it. So let me just give you one example of an EFAB project in Indonesia. And, many of you that know Indonesia and the Pacific, there's, significant problems with malnutrition, poor diets, and nutritional challenges in that part of the world. So in two of the eastern provinces in Indonesia, we sort of stepped back and we did a number of studies funded by the German Canadian governments that kind of looked at strengthening value chains on indigenous foods, and we kind of called it taking nutritional sensitive value chains. And what came out of this was that things like bananas, cassava, maize, spinach, sweet potatoes, fish were really, really important local products that we needed to put more time on. Actually also really quite important in terms of being able to market these things, but taking that much wider look rather than just pushing, as I say, the rice, the typical thing in Indonesia else, is these other ones, and incorporating that into the diet. And then just lastly, having given a bit of a shout out to Germany and Canada, I couldn't end but not giving a shout out to Norway, who've actually given EFAD $6 million over 3 years to try and really incorporate nutritional outcomes into our projects. And that sort of thing really helps for us. EFAD's a financing agency. We give grants, we lend money to governments at very highly concessional rates, but governments are borrowing. And often they're sort of less... They're less ready to borrow for some of these more difficult outcomes like nutrition. But if you can put a little bit of additional finance in there and show them the impact you can have, say, by taking a nutritional sensitive value chain, they will borrow next time to do it because they're convinced that it's a really good investment. And those small amounts of money really, really help in convincing governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. And thanks to all of you. I think it's been a really rich discussion. We've been able to touch on many of the layers of this issue, all the way up to the global layer from you, Axel, about how to think about the connection across the SDGs and where nutrition and rural communities fit in. So I know people at home at their kitchen tables can't applaud in person here, but I'm sure they are all applauding you, as I will right now, because it was a great discussion. And I thank all of you. Be well. We are about to move on to another section here. I'd like to ask the producers to put up a presentation from Dr. Satoshi Azowi, who's the Director of Global Health Policy Division at the International Cooperation Bureau in Japan's MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We would like to hear his message, and then we'll come back with some closing thoughts.
Good morning and good afternoon. Firstly, I wish to express my gratitude to EFAD for giving me the opportunity to join the discussion on nutrition and resilience today. As an input to today's discussion, it's my honor to share with you the latest progress toward upcoming Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit in 2021. We are all aware that COVID-19 has triggered a global health crisis. But the point for today is that the compounding food security and nutrition crisis could be even more severe than the immediate health impacts of COVID-19. According to a projection by The Lancet, an additional 6.7 million children will experience wasting in 2020, 14% increase over the previous year. These impacts affect women and girls in low and middle income countries the hardest. I would like to remind you that the pandemic hasn't created a new problem. The pandemic has revealed a long-standing problem, which is a lack of long-term investment and commitment on nutrition. The government of Japan remains committed to continuing Nutrition for Growth's legacy and vision, a world in which all people, including the most vulnerable, have access to safe, affordable, and nutritious food. Over the past decade, the governments of the UK, Brazil, and Japan have worked to mobilize action on nutrition commitments against the backdrop of the Olympics, and the results have been monumental, which generated over $26 billion as nutrition-specific and nutrition-related pledges. Let me also mention that, among others, the Sun movement has played a key role as a platform to mobilize policy, resources, and actions throughout the process. The government of Japan established 5 priority areas for the summit, composed of 3 pillars and 2 cross-cutting components. This comprehensive approach will help us to achieve the global targets and ending malnutrition in all its forms. The health pillar focuses on making nutrition integral to universal health coverage for sustainable development. The diet pillar focuses on building food systems that promote safe, healthy diets and nutrition, ensuring livelihoods of producers and climate smart. The resilience pillar focuses on addressing malnutrition in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. In these contexts, there's a critical need for multi-year nutrition policies and plans with targets. These 3 pillars are supported by data-driven accountability, new investment, and innovative nutrition financing. We provide a comprehensive commitment guide for all stakeholders. It gives you concrete guidance on how to develop a commitment. Let me highlight that this is guided by the SMART criteria: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. We invite all participants to visit our Nutrition for Growth website to see useful tools, including this guide. Here, I would like to introduce you to the plan for the coming year. This December, a virtual event has launched a roadmap, Nutrition for Growth Year of Action. We are excited that the UN Food Systems Summit process brings in extended networks that will help amplify engagement and commitments, as it aims to invite millions and billions to the food systems agenda. Throughout the year, a complementary set of nutrition commitments will be made, and mutually reinforcing narrative is formed about what is needed to deliver on nutrition both in response to COVID-19 and for long-term development priority. In December 2021, Tokyo Nutrition Growth Summit will anchor the year of action. Nutrition is more important than ever in light of the COVID-19 crisis. We take every opportunity to advocate the importance of nutrition. I believe that today's discussion will help every participant to further engage in the nutrition agenda in solidarity. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Satoshi, and I want to thank everyone for what I think has been a really dynamic session. We've been able to touch on so many aspects of such a critical issue. You know, you may have noticed in Dr. Satoshi's presentation, at one point he was showing the commitment to action plan, and it had the old logo for Nutrition for Growth 2020, right? Nutrition for Growth was meant to be a donor convening that happens during the Olympics. Well, this pandemic delayed the Olympics. It delayed Nutrition for Growth. It's maybe just one tiny example of the ripple effect of this global health crisis and what it's meant for so many organizations, so many people working at the front lines of an issue like food security. And it gives us some sense of hope that maybe, although we've had all this disruption and so many people are suffering, that maybe next year, as you heard in our conversations today, can be the real moment for nutrition, that donor governments and others will come together and change their perspective, as we heard, change the way they think about rural communities and people, and see an opportunity to invest. And it's certainly a topic and an issue that we at Devex have been covering closely. And we're really pleased to have been able to bring these 3 sessions together in partnership with IFAD to all of you. And really pleased to say that next year we will have a Future of Food Systems series coming forward, more journalism from Devex on this topic. If you're interested in being a part of that, email us directly at partnerships@devex.com. stay engaged with us on these issues, because we see a big opportunity in the coming year if we can really shed more light on both the challenges this pandemic has created, but also the big opportunities to address one of the critical SDGs and one of the critical issues all around the world. I thank everyone again, our partners at IFAD, certainly all of our panelists, and all of you who are following this from all over the world, for your attention and your time. Stay connected with us on Twitter and let us know what you think. It's been a pleasure to be here. Be well, everyone.